We are here to talk about innovation, breaking away from the norm. And I have two marketers here today who have made careers out of doing this. So Matthias, Silas, thank you very much for joining me today. Now, the topic of innovation is probably one of marketers' favourite words. We bring it up a lot. Stefan earlier, when he was showing some of the sustainability frameworks, innovation's core to that. We always talk about innovation. So my first question is, what does it mean to you, specific to your role, and the brand that you work within? So Matthias, do you want to start us off?
It's funny when I introduce people, or people realize where I work, sometimes the question is, why do you even need to do innovation? Or why do you need to do marketing? Coca-Cola, everyone knows, right? But reality is, if you have a 137-year-old brand or person trying to be a 25-year-old athlete, well, you can't play the same tricks that got you to where we are today. And I think that's really how we look at the brand, of trying to find ways to innovate. I don't think it's a tech-driven thing. It can be product, it can be marketing, it can be the way we engage consumers.
Yeah, I mean, if I think about it, it's a brand that's kind of innovated in many ways across the history, right? And as you say, it doesn't always mean tech. It means approaches and...
Yeah, I mean, innovation is a bit in the DNA, even of brand Coke. When you go back 100-something years, the first 20, 30 years, about 10% of our volume, we actually just distributed as free samples. We were the first to innovate and launch a beverage in a can. We launched in 1963 a brand called Tap, which was the first beverage that has 0 calories, or 1 calorie. So it's kind of been there from the very beginning, but obviously the way we look at it today is very different in terms of our ability to engage. And a brand that my parents would drink, why would I drink it? Why would my 15-year-old drink a brand that I'm drinking? And hence, we have to constantly innovate in the way we engage consumers, and something that my son comes and says, oh, I've seen this is really cool. I sometimes have to actually go to my team and say, what are we doing? Because I don't necessarily see it, realize it, except for having seen it somewhere in a presentation.
I mean, I guess the argument is you don't be a brand that's in people's lives for that long without inherently keeping up. As you say, generationally, you can just be lost if you don't. Yeah. Silas, I'd love to hear from you.
Sure. So I may take a media lens from this, not surprisingly, but the reality, I think, is media's not been the best in innovation that it could be as a overall industry. And I know that there are brilliant pockets out there, but especially when we think at a strategic level, our approach towards the craft has been, in a lot of cases, to do the same thing. And part of innovation, for us at least, is shaking things up at a variety of levels. So I'll give you a couple examples. The value that media derives and delivers to an organization historically has come through things like efficiency and cost savings, which frankly aren't really valuable at the end of the day, but they're a quantifiable number that everyone can be seemingly happy about. And reality of where media and marketing at an overall level can really derive value for their organization is to bring business in, to bring growth to a company. And so things like reframing what value means from media becomes exceptionally important as a way to change the way we think about things and how we can see the role that media plays in really driving a business outcome. And that's like one very esoteric area potentially, but other less esoteric, more functional levels are the realities of where I think a lot of media activity has gone over the past few years. And I know we don't want to say the pandemic word, but I guess we're going to have to say the pandemic word at some point. The reality is, as an organization or any organization that looks at trying to influence a consumer, you look at all the media channels that exist out there. We all stopped buying things other than home-based media channels for 2 years. And of course you did, right? No one was on the streets. No one was consuming these. Of course, there's some gray areas in that space, but the reality is we got into a rut as an organization and as an industry in terms of the channels that we use. And so part of our shakeup as well is saying, we know there's value in being in a variety of different environments. We know consumers are different. The way that they operate can be very different, even in that audience that you've so-called hung your hats on in that space. And we need to be smart about how we influence that consumer and really build effectiveness into our plans through the application of smart thinking, consumer-led behaviors, and channel diversity.
Yeah. I want to dig into this provocation there of like us potentially being in a rut as an industry from an innovation point of view. Silas, how did we get to this point? What do you mean by a rut there?
I think the most amazing part about marketers in general is their interest in pushing the envelopes in a variety of areas. The fact that we have Web3 people on stage talking about NFTs when the audiences are still small is brilliant, because we are, as a collective industry, so interested in where things are going to go. And that interest takes us down routes, right? It takes us down the data route for many years, right? Oh, I just need to learn everything about my customer through data and then the marketing plan will write itself. Well, no, it doesn't. But sometimes you need to travel down that journey. And I think a lot of us have traveled down the journey, for example, in the reach-based planning space. And there's not necessarily something inherently wrong with that. But reach-based planning starts to pigeonhole your approach to talking to consumers into a selection of channels. And those channels aren't wrong. And they are delivering that reach that they claim to deliver in many cases. But are there better ways there to think about things differently? And that's why you're starting to see in the industry conversations around things like attention come to play. Because we know that there are ways to define this better. And now we're, again, starting on those steps to go down that new path and determine what will be valuable for us and how we redefine what effectiveness means, what marketing means, and what innovation means.
Absolutely. Matthias, you're coming from a different lens. It's not necessarily the sort of media side. But what do you think about this idea that we're potentially in a bit of a rut at the moment? Do you agree? Do you disagree?
If I could look back just 3-4 years, we were probably at 60-70% of my media investment would go in TV. Right? In CPG, we don't have the kind of data, even with all the efforts we're doing now, that we have in other industry. Tech has a lot more data. The purchase, for me, it's all about weekly plus consumption. So what's my metric? It's how do I build weekly plus consumption? Very different to what you were talking earlier about on Nissan, where it's every couple of years where I go into and really am in the market to build a car. Today, that looks very different. I have markets where 75-80% of our investment is digital, not as display advertising, but in the digital space. And what we're doing globally is we run this year around 250 experiments in a consolidated way. We're trying to write our own laws, because obviously we all know how TV works, or we pretend to know how TV works, right? But reality is, in some of the new spaces, we don't, right? And we got to learn together, and that's the way we try to build in the efficiency, learn for ourselves. And when we do the same things in a couple of markets and we start seeing the same outputs, then we write our own laws and say, okay, if it's worth and working in a few places, it's probably worth replicating elsewhere.
I love how sort of specifically you have those experiments set to kind of force you into that mindset. Because the next question I wanted to bring up was, and it was touched on earlier about the importance of effectiveness at the moment, because you do have lots of external factors, macroeconomic factors, all sorts of things forcing marketers to really kind of consider where they are spending their investments and what it's delivering. But on the flip side, you still want to do new things. You still want to invest to surprise people. That can be, I assume, a balancing act. How do you balance those two things? Happy for either of you to go first?
Yeah. Look, I think as the Coca-Cola company, we're going through the biggest transformation in marketing that we have ever gone through. And we're very fortunate that our CMO is giving us the license to fail, which makes it very easy for me to go and try out new things. Yeah. Now, there's a difference between being stupid versus being conscious about it, right? But I'm not expected that everything works. Actually, I had a conversation last night with one of the brand managers on my team. I said, if everything that you do works, you're not pushing yourselves hard enough. And I think that freedom that I'm being given by my boss really allows us to push the envelope and try things that otherwise we would never be doing.
I love that. That must just be such a weird thing to hear from your boss. Like, you're doing too well, which means you're not doing well enough. Silas, what do you think?
Yeah, sure. I've had the honor of working for a few companies which, and you too as well, produce products which people ingest, right? And when you do that, you become perfectionist, right, as an organization. And that breeds through everything. You can't create medicine or create food that's going to make people sick anytime, anywhere. So you really get smart and really diligent about everything that you do. And that's, of course, brilliant when you're talking about producing something that someone's eating. It's less brilliant when you're talking about doing marketing, right? And unfortunately, that perfectionist mentality starts to breed through in everything. And the notion of failure in a lot of these organizations is horribly scary for everyone, right? So I think some of the ways that we start to mitigate that fear, is to start to talk about the realities and spectrums of the kinds of tests that we run, what we're doing, how we're being smart about our bets. And, we talked earlier, Stefan talked earlier about, how little marketing leans on finance. And these are great times to lean on finance, right? If you can prove to the finance team why your innovative idea makes sense to put a bet on, then you can be pretty solid in your own self that you're solid in that. And that is leaning more towards that perfectionist side of mitigating risk and reducing errors and failures. Doesn't mean that they don't happen still, but at least you go in with a really sort of robust, arms-locked approach amongst the entire organization to deliver against that. And it makes it difficult, absolutely, because it removes the, if you will, the faith-based side of the spectrum, right, of marketing innovation. Let's just do this to see what happens. And that's probably a bad thing. And I think why you look at marketers like Coca-Cola and you see how innovative they are because they're being offered that freedom to innovate and to be on that faith-based end. But there's still a lot of value in, finding that way to convince people that this is the right thing to do. And maybe it's part of that heritage, but it also works in a way that allows us to keep pushing forward and at least doing some things that are innovative as to being completely on the other side.
Yeah, when we had our call earlier this week, and we were kind of discussing this topic, we did talk about this idea of having a healthy dose of faith. Yeah. There's a healthy dose of faith that you can have. We were actually talking about sort of Coca-Cola specifically and how you kind of invest in things like generative AI and in a meaningful way. It's to be applauded. The question that I have around healthy dose of faith is, what part does leadership play in that? I mean, you touched on it earlier, Matthias. Does it have to come from the top, for example?
I think it helps, right? If I only look at the science side to my team, and I force them to come with results immediately, or prove before I approve what I'm expecting to see, of course, I think I'm removing the willingness to push the envelope and go into spaces. So I think it has to be that balance of art and science. I had a conversation a couple of weeks back with my team. It was proposing a campaign on TikTok for Vietnam. Look, I'm not an 18-year-old Vietnamese, obviously, so who am I to judge whether that's going to work or not? That worked with the TikTok creative team. That for me was the stamp where I said, okay, if the TikTok creative team that in the end wants some advertising dollars, says this is going to work, there's probably a lot to it. And reality is we got in the first 4 weeks, or first 2 weeks, 200 million views just within Vietnam. And that obviously then gets you the confidence. I didn't like what they were presenting, but I'm not the target audience. So I think that's one of the areas where we have to every now and then step back and say, are we really the ones who we designed work for? Do we need to like it? Well, I'm not 18, I'm not Vietnamese, so definitely I do not need to like it. I need to understand intellectually what we're trying to do. If it's on brand, go give it a shot, and we'll see very quickly if it works or not. And in this case, it worked phenomenally well.
It's interesting, it's like having the faith in that to let it run, but also it's kind of dropping your ego as a marketer slightly as well to admit that you don't know everything. Yeah. Silas, what about you?
So Matthias is exactly right. I mean, when you have senior leader buy-in or mandates, everything just becomes paved with gold on your route towards whatever you want to do. But the reality is that doesn't always happen, and I think it's really the burden of everyone in the room and everyone in the industry to start to think about the role that they can play. And I love how Matthias's boss has sort of articulated it to him, and I'm sure that at some point, somewhere, someone says to him, was that Vietnam TikTok video really the right thing to do? Probably not that specific, but you know what I mean. There's an opportunity here for us as leaders to also manage upwards and provide that air cover for our teams to be able to say, okay, we're going to take these 5 bets, right? Bets 1, 2, 3, 4, probably pretty safe. Bet 5, maybe not. So what do? How do we sort of manage the dialogue upwards to people to say, we're not sure if this is going to work, but we have X, Y, and Z reasons to believe why it will. Give my team the bandwidth to do it. It may not work the first time. I need to run tests across the next year to do that, or I need to prove it with outcome and measurement to say that this is the right route to take. But I need either that runway or I need that time, I need that investment. And you as that leader can be that, that barrier, that buffer between people just saying, why are we doing this? This doesn't work. And the teams who are honestly motivated and excited usually to do these kinds of things. I mean, I'm sure the Vietnam team is sitting there saying, I love it. I'm working in exactly the right platform for my audience with the right kind of content, and I have the license to make that happen, right? How empowering is that for junior marketers or even mid-level marketers in your organization? And you as a leader, when you provide them that air cover, you give them that license to be able to do all of that. So, I think part of that managing up is to try to get the senior leaders to put whatever you're doing on their KPI sheet for the year so they keep on asking everyone if they're doing it or not, and that's all good and definitely a proper route to take. But there's all other routes to take too, which is really about that empowerment, I think, which is really valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. And you want your teams to feel inspired, right, by your brand. Earlier on when we were talking about TikTok and product marketing, it's about kind of living and breathing that brand, right? And if you're just doing the norm, you're going to have a disengaged team. One of the flip sides of this conversation, I guess, is if you focus too much on innovation and the newness, you can kind of go chasing for the shiny new thing, and you can kind of lose sight of the core of the brand. How do you keep that balance within your teams and within what you're doing?
I think there's a few routes to take, right? When you start thinking about, I hate to be so crass as to talk about money, but as you start thinking about your budgets for the year, have you adequately set aside investment levels to really push the boundaries in certain areas? Because we know as soon as plans get developed and we talk about that rut, the same channels, the same media plan gets naturally propagated, right? So if you ring fence things to say, I don't care what you do with that money, you figure out what the right idea to do with it is, but I don't want to see a traditional based approach there. That's a really strong way to start it from the beginning to help deliver that. I think then you need to be smart about what you go after and what you don't go after, right? And we all have sort of operating principles and rules. I've had things in the past like no shiny object syndrome, right? You need to have a certain scale of people either involved in that or using that, especially if you're talking about a CPG or a general consumer brand that's going to be able to create an impact. So what we hate to see have happen is people run around on innovation that doesn't really create a business impact, right? It doesn't have even the potential to, because it influenced 1,500 people. It's not going to really do anything. So you really need to find ways either that you scale that so that more people are influenced, or you start off in an environment, a platform, an approach, which will have a certain critical mass, if you will, that will influence the business and drive some kind of change. So I think once you start building these processes and lenses into the way you approach things, it gets a little better in terms of not just doing every little innovation. The back of my mind always has that what if though, right? Like, what if you did this cool thing that did influence 1,000 people and maybe was irrelevant for 5 years and then builds that sense of knowledge in the next 10 years, right? Or whatever. And there's always that doubt in your mind. So I don't know what you want to call it. It's the ejection button or something. But sometimes you also just need, going back to that faith-based approach, to say, it's okay. Like, this is the one where we don't care. We're just going to see what happens. And sometimes that may not necessarily abide by all those rules that you set for yourself. So set rules and then break them.
I like that. Matthias, are you breaking rules that you've set?
Look, I think if you don't reinvent ourselves on a constant basis, we're missing a trick somewhere, right? But it's reinventing often of something that we know. Right? When I think about the role physical experiences used to have when I was a junior brand manager, then they at some point disappeared, disappeared completely during COVID, and now we're starting to rebuild that muscle. Now, you spoke about 1,500 people reach. Now, that was the problem back in the late 90s or early 2000s, where you couldn't necessarily get the reach off of an event. Right? We're now designing our events consciously with a mindset of how do we integrate them from the beginning to the end. We're running food fests in a couple of countries that start off from weeks before with the traditional media partnerships that we always used to do. And it might still be including radio or even a magazine if that's relevant in the country. But it includes the customers. It brings in our customers. We give them a platform to then connect differently. If we select the right food partners, it's actually really interesting for teens to come because they get access to food that otherwise might be very hard to get into. Right? Think about burnt ends and how many people are trying to get a table reservation in Singapore. Now, put them into a food fest and the equivalent for Generation Z, all of a sudden this becomes a very attractive thing. Now, if you turn that into a content machine that then allows you over the next couple of weeks and months to continue playing the same story, then all of a sudden it's not just about the couple of thousand people that actually see the event, but how do you bring it to life over time? And that's really what we're trying to do. So going back to some of the things that we know, trying to reinvent them in a way that they actually arrive in 2023 or 2025.
It's interesting because you're sort of fundamentally talking about creating an experience, right? And it's an experience for the consumer, and then part of that might be innovative and digital, or how we're thinking about innovation in that sort of tech sense. But some of it's fundamentally, the experiences that we built before. When we talk about the rut that we're kind of in, I guess as we move out of the bigger factors that have contributed to that, like the pandemic, etc., how important has experience become beyond our kind of home experience then? Has your marketing shifted towards events again and experiences as that's developed?
Yes, significantly. Yeah. I mean, that's really the muscle that we're rebuilding. Yeah. We've forgotten about it for a while. But at the end of the day, for me, it's not TV any longer towards a purchase. In our case, it's from the shelf out, and how do I get closer to the shelf and create that experience and send out at the point of sale, which of course is not under my control in many ways. So how do I build an experience that actually brings the brand to life as close as possible to point of sale, which might be in a supermarket targeted at the shopper, or if you talk about universities and the surroundings, it's actually targeted at the core consumer.
Yeah. And one thing that I thought was interesting as we were talking about the kind of shiny object element of it, and then keeping it rooted in kind of what's happened before, it was making me think about the Web3 session earlier, and that there's kind of been a bit of cynicism around that now. But as I was kind of watching that, it's the journalist in me wants the cynicism to be like, oh, not many people are using that, or X, Y, Z. But I think we can't be too cynical about that, right? Because we'd never try anything new. So I feel like this has been an interesting conversation after that Web3 session, because these topics like Web3, generative AI as the next topic, we have a healthy dose of cynicism, but also that kind of faith, right? It's getting that balance. As we head towards the end, I actually just want to ask a few questions on your favorite innovations. So both what you've done and you're sort of proud of, but then also things that you wish you've done. So let's start with your favorite innovative project that you've kind of been a part of, and why.
I start with one that's actually not me, but us as a company in the way we approach. So you mentioned earlier we've put in a small team in Atlanta that looks after generative AI. There were a lot of companies that said when ChatGPT started becoming mainstream, all of a sudden they're like, oh, let's ban it from our environment. We actually went in very early and said, how can we get all of our HR policies and stuff uploaded into ChatGPT, into a safe environment, and save a huge amount of time by me asking a question, and all of a sudden I get the answer in seconds. My team is spread out in 10 locations. I have no idea what the vacation schedule is for each of the countries. So all of a sudden I can get access to these kind of things from a business perspective. We set up and created very early on a platform for designers to use ChatGPT and DALL-E and create, using elements that we had taken out of our archives, new forms of advertising. And I think the fact that we give ourselves the freedom to try and explore and push ourselves is something that I think is fascinating. And we just announced yesterday the launch of a new Coca-Cola Creations product, which was actually done using generative AI, combining with qualitative research, we try to understand what is it that consumers think of year 3000. Then we use all of those prompts to have actually generative AI design the packaging, etc., design the product, or use that as a way to brief the development team to actually develop a product.
That's
so
interesting.
it's just a playful way, and I think the biggest thing we can do is remove the fear that people have of, oh my God, is this going to take over my job? I don't understand it. No, just jump into it, try something, and some things will work, some things won't.
Yeah, absolutely. And what innovation do you wish you'd have been a part of? What do you envy that another brand has done, perhaps?
Look, I think the fascinating space is always, people jump quickly in these kind of questions to Nike. But if you think about fashion or apparel and how brands have come and gone, I think it's really interesting to look at someone like ASICS, who a couple of years ago was almost unknown, had disappeared, and then the way they use collaborations and partnerships has really resurfaced them. And I think having been part of that strategy from the beginning and seeing it through and seeing it play out would be a really nice one where you're like, you know what, I've put my stamp on that one. I think is one that would make anyone who was part of that, at least the way I see it from the outside, extremely proud.
I agree. We have to get ASICS on the stage at some point then, tell that story. Silas, what about you? What have you been most proud of being part of?
Thanks, Matthias, for giving great answers, which now makes mine sound really rubbish. Of course, because I'm coming from the media side. I mean, one of the things that I experienced over the last few years, which has been, at least for me, massively personally fulfilling, but also I think fulfilling for the organization, is this notion of transition of what value means, right? And I was speaking esoterically, as I mentioned at the beginning, but the reality is, in a lot of profit-driven organizations, media is viewed as a commodity. And commodities are designed to be obtained at the cheapest possible price. And that's a fundamental failure of understanding around what media truly delivers, right? And people sit there and say a GRP is a GRP, so I just need to buy the cheapest GRP I can, without really understanding the value that buying things like quality and better placements and everything else can deliver, right? Really giving your creative and your messaging the chance to live, breathe, and influence, right? And so, when I joined GSK back then, now Haleon, the emphasis was all on that, all on cost. And being able to migrate an organization with the same people in it to thinking very, very differently about the value that media can derive to the company, how it's better to spend more on media than less on rubbish media, has been an absolutely amazing journey of change, right? And part of that is even the idea of reframing the systems we use, the KPIs we set. Again, I know it's not as sexy as the stuff he's talking about, but still, really exciting stuff for us media buffins. And I think the reality is there's so much more to do in that space, because it breeds out all these aspects around how do we measure better, how do we define what consumers really want, how do we engage with them in that way. And it's just the tip of the iceberg still, but it's so cool, and definitely really excited about that. I think if I had to put one name out there, it's the way that L'Oreal has seemed to balance brand building, visuals, emotion with hardcore data, and bring those all together in such a seamless and brilliant model that just works so well. I mean, I mentioned that those data routes that we took, and a lot of them were dead ends, especially for us big mass brands. They really figured it out, right? And they figured out how to be interesting and engaging in youth-based platforms, to have hardcore CRM-based programs running underneath it all. It's really amazing. So if I thought about a marketer who was changing the way they did business and operating in a way that's really innovative, they would get my vote.
Yeah, well, those foundational things then allow you to do all the fun, sexy stuff on top.
Exactly.
Right, exactly. Well, in summary then, I think we all need a healthy dose of faith. That would be my one takeaway. But we also need the foundations to be able to do effective marketing and sell internally and convince